Lord, thank you for the gifts that you've given Bev and for the many ways that you have been able to use her as a minister of you and your word throughout the years. We thank you that she's here today, and we ask for you to be upon her and to bless her words for us now and later today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Good morning. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me here to Wanner. One of the other things, the connections between me and you and Glenn's family is that I am the chaplain at Parkwood Mennonite Home. And while I was on a leave of absence last fall in order to pack up and move our family into a new house and help Jeff's parents pack up and move into a new house as well, Susan, Glenn's wife, covered my leave of absence. So she was the acting chaplain. And in fact, this morning, so that I could be here, Susan is preaching at Parkwood. So it's a shared event. And I was just speaking with Lester Bechtel before we began the service, and it didn't matter where Lester was, whether he stayed at Parkwood this morning or came here, he was going to be hearing either Parkwood or Wanner, one in both settings. So that's that's our another one of our connections. Well, some months ago, Glenn asked me to speak about assisted suicide, and I said yes. And I decided in these last several weeks that one has to be either very brave or very foolish to attempt this topic in a sermon. And I think perhaps I am both today. Although I'm not feeling very brave, I'm feeling kind of scared. So I need to start this sermon with a whole pile of disclaimers, things that I am not. The first thing that I am not is a legal expert. So I cannot give you any kind of legal commentary on what the new Supreme Court of Canada ruling is and isn't. I am not a medical doctor. So I can't talk about terminal illness from a medical point of view. I can't talk about treatment of severe pain. I can't talk about palliative treatment options. That's not my area of expertise. Something else I'm not is somebody who lives with chronic, unbearable pain or with a terminal illness. So I cannot reflect personally as somebody who might accept or reject the idea of assisted suicide. Nor am I somebody who has had a family member live with searing, unbearable pain. So I can't speak from that point of view either. But here is what I am. I am a nursing home chaplain. And I have done this work, usually for primarily part-time at about 22 hours a week, for nearly 13 years. And my work takes me every day, every shift, into places where life and death are so, so close. I am someone who has sat at the bedside of, and I was trying to figure this out, at the bedside of over 100 people as they lay near death. And I have been so, so very privileged to be at that bedside when some of those people have taken their last breath, when they have moved from this world into the next. I am someone who has had the privilege of listening to and supporting many family members as they have walked alongside their dying ones, if they have sat at bedsides. And most importantly for us this morning, I am a Christian. I am someone who claims the promise of Jesus Christ, the promise that he came to give us life more abundantly. I am someone who tries to live by his teaching that we are to love one another. And then one final disclaimer. I am not here today representing Parkwood Mennonite Home where I work. Although, I might add, if you end up appreciating my sermon today, feel free to call my boss and tell her what a great job I did. If you find yourself less than satisfied with me this morning, well, just tell me, or tell Glyn, or talk about it in the Sunday school class, or with your family over lunch. We'll just leave my boss out of the loop if you don't like what I have to say. So, a sermon on assisted suicide. As Glyn and I talked about this over the last several months, he said that what he was really looking for was someone to start the conversation, that people here wanted to talk about this issue. And I find that conversations are usually the most interesting when they involve lots of questions and back and forth and maybe something even a little provocative. So this morning, I may ask you some questions and ask you to call back. Glyn's already warmed you up with his amens. I might ask you to turn to a neighbor to discuss something. I might just throw out a bunch of questions. We'll see where my notes and where the Spirit lead us today. First, we need to understand what we're talking about. Glyn has been using the phrase assisted death. I talk about assisted suicide because that's the phrase that's been in the news a lot. Tell me, and now I mean for you to call it out, can you tell me what is assisted suicide as you understand it? What is it? Helping someone to die. Anybody want to add to that?
Someone who has made a choice.
It's someone who has made a choice. Yes. Yeah, helping someone who has made a choice to die. Yeah. It can be helping that someone with either a prescription or with the means to die, or it can be simply providing someone with information. Those are all ways in which assisted suicide can help. A legal-ish definition I found is assisted suicide is providing another with the knowledge or the means to intentionally end his or her life. In the newspaper, what we're reading about, particularly following the Supreme Court decision of February, is conversation about physician-assisted suicide. What's the difference, or what is physician-assisted suicide? Yeah. Yeah, it's the physician, the doctor, now being the one to give the drug or some other means for the person to be able to die. So the physician providing the means through pills or an injection or knowledge, information, for someone to commit suicide. Now, the other term that's often used is euthanasia. How is it different from physician-assisted suicide? Does anybody care to wander into those waters of the difference between physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia? The Latimer case, was that a physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia? Right. So the Robert Latimer case in Saskatchewan, where there was a daughter in a family, and she was born with severe disabilities, and the father couldn't stand what was happening anymore, and he decided to end her life. So euthanasia is killing somebody else. Sometimes we call that mercy killing. Euthanasia is the deliberate action taken by one person to intentionally end the life of another person with the reason of relieving that person's suffering. So here the physician not only provides the meds, but then actually administers them with the intent to cause death rather. And the person who dies, who receives those medications or treatment, may be incapable of deciding whether or not to accept those medications. Sometimes we think of euthanasia also. We use that term particularly when we are talking about the death of someone who's not able to make that decision. So an infant, someone like in the Latimer case, think her name was Tracy, who could not make that decision herself, and a parent made that decision for her. So typically we talk about euthanasia as being a death that is caused and that the person who is dying or who dies doesn't have a say in the matter.
But we would, in a legal sense, call that murder.
So in the back, we would in a legal sense call that murder. Not anymore in Canada, not since the Supreme Court decision. Until February, yes. Well, my understanding, and again, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't speak to this. My understanding is that until next February 2016, it will still be murder. It has to, in 2016 of February, it will change. So the law is, that has been the law for decades here in Canada is still the law, but the Supreme Court of Canada gave the government of Canada 1 year from whatever the date was, February something, so until February of 2016, to change the law to allow for physician-assisted suicide. Yeah, so at this point, we would still call it murder in Canada.
Physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia?
We're getting to that. Now that's exactly my next point. What did the Supreme Court of Canada decide? I'm going to read it for you. Assisted suicide will be legal as of next February for a competent adult person, so someone who is over 18, and competent, that means legally a competent person, mentally able to make decisions about how to run his or her life. A competent adult person who, number one, clearly consents to the termination of life, and number two, has a grievous and irremediable medical condition, including an illness, a disease, or disability that causes enduring suffering that is intolerable to the individual in the circumstances of his or her condition. There's a lot packed into that line. I'll read it for you one more time, but I have also prepared a handout for you, and that handout you'll get at the end of the service, and it has the wording of the legal document so that you can see it. So assisted suicide will be legal in Canada as of next February for a competent adult person who, one, clearly consents to the termination of life, and two, has a grievous and irremediable medical condition, which includes an illness, a disease, or a disability that causes enduring suffering that is intolerable to the individual in the circumstances of his or her condition. The difference between that and euthanasia gets a little fuzzy in that if I am the person who wants to die because of a grievous medical condition, and my doctor examines me and says I'm competent and I'm an adult and I'm agreeing, I meet all of the standards set out by the Supreme Court. And so he agrees to, say, give me a prescription for medication that will allow me to die. Some legal experts say that my doctor is now performing euthanasia, even though I have agreed to die. So some people make a clear distinction, saying that euthanasia is only performed on people who cannot ask for it, whether because of they're not old enough to, or they are not well enough to ask for it. And other people say that whenever a doctor gives a prescription or gives an injection into someone to cause death, then that doctor is performing euthanasia, whether or not the person who is dying requested it. I don't really think it matters terribly much how we use those terms, but I'm going to be primarily talking about physician-assisted suicide because that's what the Supreme Court was asked to rule on. Okay. We have established who I am and who I am not, what my qualifications are and what they are not. We've tried to establish our terms, and I've read to you what the Supreme Court ruling is. Here's a question for you that might be trickier than you might want to approach on a Sunday Mother's Day morning. Under what conditions do you think you might possibly consider for yourself physician-assisted suicide? Your answer to that could be never ever, or it could be maybe under certain conditions, or yes, bring it on, I don't want any kind of pain at the end of my life, or somewhere in between. So I want you just to consider this for yourselves. Don't call out anything. Under what conditions do you think you might consider physician-assisted suicide? Now I'd like you to turn to a neighbor, preferably somebody to whom you are not married, and answer the question in twos. So turn to a neighbor. If it's your mother or your father you're sitting next to, that's fine, but preferably not someone to whom you're married. Under what conditions might you consider assisted suicide? Take another minute to finish your conversations. All right, can you wrap them up, please? Thank you. I think all I needed to do this morning was to ask that question, and now we've started chatting. So these are important questions. Now I'd like some of you just to call out in a word or two. What might some conditions be, or would you never, ever even consider it?
How do you know until you're actually there? This question is premature.
Premature is this, it's this too, we can't talk about it until we're there. Somebody else.
The question I have, God has not given us, He will never give us pain that we cannot bear. And yet my second question is, if we commit suicide, is that God's plan?
So God has never given us more pain than we can bear, and if we commit suicide, is that part of God's plan? Those are good questions, yeah. Somebody else. What other things were you talking about in all of this buzz?
The difference between stopping something that's extraordinary care and assisted.
What is the difference between stopping something which is extraordinary care, sometimes we talk about heroic measures, and assisted suicide? Where is the line between stopping treatment and assisted suicide? Yeah?
We have, I think it's distorted view of death, and we don't think of death as a friend.
We have in our society, I think you mean, a distorted view of death, and we don't think of death as our friend. I think most of you could be up here preaching this sermon instead of me. Anybody else have something to comment on?
In today's scientific world we live in, we have the opportunity to extend people's life. I think more than when I was a mother in a nursing home, one of the questions And that's a question, I guess, in today's day and age, we're all going to be asked. And so, as opposed to suicide, or assisted suicide, to what extent do we want to extend our life? And to what means, without allowing the natural process to occur?
So the comment here was that we, in this century, and this time, we have the ability to, through medical advances, to prolong our lives. And you were commenting that when you took your mother to the nursing home, that you were asked the question, how much what do you want us to do as she nears the end of her life? And do you want extraordinary measures? Do you want comfort measures? Do you want something in between? And I've been a part of that conversation many times with families, many times, yes. Well, there are many reasons why people might never consider assisted suicide, and many reasons why people might consider assisted suicide. Sort of the top responses, and we touched on some of those here, are if I have pain that is beyond anything I can bear, if I have an illness, a terminal illness, and there's no chance that I'm going to survive it, and the process of the dying is going to be very difficult on me and my family, am I now dependent on somebody for care? Think of Sue Rodriguez, who was the famous person who died with assistance in BC in the 80s, 90s, I think. She had ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, could no longer dress herself. I think she could feed herself, but there are many basic things that she couldn't do anymore. She was dependent on others for most every part of her life. Those are sort of the three big things: the pain, a terminal illness where there's no hope of recovery, or becoming completely dependent on somebody else. Then there are people who would never, ever consider it, because of some of the things that we've talked about today. It's not God's plan. Suicide's not part of God's plan. And then there are people who just say, I don't know. I can't know until I am there. So sort of 5 approaches. And then there are people who would say yes, because of the pain, the terminal illness. Well, I asked you that question because that's the question that people ask. Is assisted suicide, physician-assisted suicide, good? Is it right? Should we have it as law? What do we think as Christians of physician-assisted suicide? And I made you answer that question together, made you talk about it, made you speak it out in a group. But here's the thing. I think it's the wrong question. More to the point, I think that for us as Christians, it doesn't focus on the right thing. I think that the law needs to be clear. But what I have been thinking about more and more is that an endless debate on physician-assisted suicide focuses us on the wrong thing, or more precisely, it takes our focus away from the right thing. So, at the same time that I believe we need to refocus or re-ask the question of physician-assisted suicide, I also want to say that I passionately believe that there are many, many, many valid reasons for why physician-assisted suicide as law in Canada is problematic. First of all, who decides that someone is a competent adult person? Someone has to make that decision, and that's not always straightforward. What about people who live with severe disabilities? Will they be pressured to allow physician-assisted suicide to be performed on themselves because the physician or the medical community sees them as a burden to the medical system? Will family members or friends or neighborhoods say, well, why is he still alive? After all, the law allows him to die. Like, this is enough already. And there's a strong, strong movement among the community of people who live with disability to fight physician-assisted suicide. And on the handout, again, that I've prepared for you, there's a reference to that website, to one particular website, 2 websites. The one is my favorite name is called Not Dead Yet. So even though I'm limited by a disability, I'm not dead yet. So please don't make me go all the way. So another issue that I have with focusing our conversation endlessly on whether or not to allow or consider physician-assisted suicide is that it takes away from a most necessary conversation on end-of-life care. And it takes away from most necessary funding for end-of-life care. So we need to talk about what it is that we want at the end of our lives, what our goals are for our deaths, far more than we need to talk about whether or not we need physician-assisted suicide. Now, something that the Supreme Court of Canada decision doesn't even touch on, and I think this is part of where Glenn heard my passion last fall, is that physician-assisted suicide is not only about the person who requests death. It is also about those who are left behind. The family members, the caregivers, the broader community, the friends. They can be left saying, didn't we do enough? What else could we have done? I didn't get a chance to say goodbye. It's a whole nother piece to physician-assisted suicide that isn't talked about. So there are many, many excellent resources about the many facets of why physician-assisted suicide is not the best option for us as Canadians. And as I said, I've got this handout for you to look at. Well, all of that aside, we are here not just as Canadians with an interest in what's going to happen when the federal government comes down with some new laws, but we are here as Christians to talk about this issue. So I want to think together with you theologically for a bit about one of the things that many people in Canada mention when it comes to considering physician-assisted suicide, why they would consider it. And that is that of dependency. The Sue Rodriguez example I used. If I were, some people say, as dependent as someone like Sue on somebody else for everything, I don't think I could keep living. That fear echoes what I think is a broader societal fear of being dependent. We, as Christians, I think, are afraid of that. We, as Canadians, are afraid of it. But I want to tell you a story about dependency that might surprise you. And I suspect by this point, with all this talking about the law and legal definitions, you might be ready for a story. It's the story of a woman I met through my work at Parkwood. Her name is Janet, and I have changed many things about this story, including her name. Janet was in the nursing home because she was ill, which is really the only reason you get to live in a nursing home. You are frail. She was unable to walk, unable to dress herself, to feed herself. She could feed herself a little bit, but not much. Unable to get herself on or off the toilet. She was, however, mentally alert. Now, you might look at her and see someone who had no quality of life. That's a phrase that's often thrown around. There's no quality of life. You might have thought that Janet was living a life that wasn't worth living. You might think, well, if I were Janet, I'd rather be dead. And yet, when I would lead my weekly Bible study, and Janet would attend, Janet has died several years ago, and Janet would attend, as she usually did, I would ask of the group my regular opening question: what are you grateful for today? And Janet, wheelchair-using, dependent, crippled, unable to dress herself, Janet said to the question, what are you grateful for today? I'm grateful for my life. Janet, crippled, dependent, wheelchair-using Janet said, I am grateful for my life. I'm grateful for my life. We might not think Janet had much of a life, but Janet knew she had a good life. She had a daughter and a son-in-law who adored her. She had made many friends among the staff, and she enjoyed their company, and they enjoyed hers. She had wonderful memories of a wonderful husband. She enjoyed plants and nature, and she enjoyed very much looking at the plants in her room and looking out the window at God's creation. She had a deep Christian faith, and that sustained her, particularly attending monthly Mass, which we hold at Parkwood, Roman Catholic Mass through our local parish, through receiving communion weekly, through attending other religious services. Plus, she enjoyed attending other programs at Parkwood as she was able to. "I am grateful for my life," said Janet. And Janet wasn't alone in this answer. Many, many, many times when I would ask that question, "What are you grateful for today?" half of the people in that circle would answer a variation of that response. "I'm happy for my life. I'm grateful for this day. I'm happy I woke up this morning." And everyone in that circle was very frail, either in a wheelchair or they were very unsteady on their feet. They had difficulty with one part of their lives or another. As I said, you don't get to be in a nursing home without being frail and ill. Well, whenever I tell this story, people outside a nursing home setting are amazed. They think they could never be happy in that setting. They could never be happy being as dependent, as needy as Janet was. A number of years ago, there was an interesting study done. You may have heard about it. When people who had suffered from a severe spinal cord injury and ended up paralyzed, and I think that this study was on both people paralyzed from the waist down or from the chest down. The study was surveying their emotional responses to life. Many of them, in the first weeks, months after the accident, were thinking very seriously about suicide, researching ways to kill themselves as they lived in this new state of being completely paralyzed. When they were surveyed a year or two later, I'm not exactly sure how much later, they were, of course, still paralyzed. Spinal cord injury is still permanent. However, the vast majority of them rated the quality of their lives either the same or as better as their pre-paralysis selves. So despite the fact that they were now dependent on others for so much that the course of their life was completely changed, the majority of them said that the quality of their lives was either the same or better as the quality of their life before their accident. There are other studies that show that people, mainly like we are here, that we consistently underestimate the quality of life we would have if we were to be diagnosed with a serious medical condition. So if you were to do a survey right now to be asked, how do you think the quality of your life would be if you had paralysis, or if you had to be on dialysis because your kidneys had failed, or whatever, most of us seriously underestimate what we think our quality of our life would be when it's compared with how people actually feel living with those conditions. And yet, we are so afraid of being dependent. Have you ever heard someone say, I don't want to be a burden to my children? Have you ever said that? I don't want to be a burden to my children? Have you ever heard someone say, I don't ever want to move into a nursing home? Or maybe you've said that yourself. Maybe you've turned your eyes away from somebody with severe disabilities because you're embarrassed, you're ashamed, or you don't want to be like that person, to think about what that might mean to live like that yourself. We fret when we are sick and when we need help. And ads for Tylenol or ibuprofen tell us that if we're sick, take something like a Tylenol and you'll feel better and can get right back to your work right away. When instead you need to be in bed keeping your germs away from me, thank you very much, and getting better. Here's the thing. I think that one of the key messages of the gospel is that Jesus wants us to be dependent. This Christian life that we are leading, that we are learning about, that we are living together is actually about being dependent. It's about learning to be dependent on God, on Jesus. It's about learning to depend on others and to become interdependent. Think for a minute. When Jesus talks to his disciples and the crowds around him about entering the kingdom of heaven, who does he say that people should be like? What kind of people should his disciples copy? I heard it. Children. I thought about having having that scripture read, but then you wouldn't have had to think about the answer. We are to be like children, not like successful, rich camel owners, or whatever the first century equivalent of a self-sufficient business owner was. Jesus wanted his disciples, the people who followed him, to be like children. And children need each other. Children need parents. They need a community to care for them. Jesus wanted us to be somebody who depends on another, like people who depend on each other. And who does Jesus reach out to throughout his ministry? Well, over and over, he reaches out to the people who are at the fringes of society. The woman who had the 12 years of menstrual bleeding and was therefore untouchable and unclean. He reaches out to the lepers. He reaches out to the tax collectors. He reaches out to the prostitute. He keeps hanging out with people who were not the strong, silent, independent types. He is known and belittled for spending too much time with sinners, too much time with people who are needy, too much time with people who need his message. And paradoxically, much as we think we don't want to be dependent, in times of dependency, that is when Christian community shines. Now, I don't know your congregation very well, but if I were a betting woman, I would bet my bottom dollar that if someone in these pews found out tomorrow that they had a serious, serious illness, would need surgery within the week and then months of rehab afterwards, why? You would all be in there like a dirty shirt. You would be providing meals, helping out with child care or elder care. You would be providing rides. You would be mowing the lawn, taking dandelions out of the garden. You would be organizing people to stop in regularly to do what needs doing. Am I right? Is that what you would do?
Amen.
Exactly. You have done it over and over. We Christians, we churches, are very good at supporting each other in times of dependency. And it isn't just the Christian church within the Christian church that we know about this. Other people notice this too. A few weeks ago, I was at a meeting of my book club. It's a group of wonderful women, most of whom do not attend church. We were talking about a difficult time that someone in the group was experiencing. Lots of things were weighing on her, and she was spending a lot of time driving family members around to various daytime medical appointments. One of the women, who is not a church-going person, said to the person in distress, "I know you go to church. Could you ask somebody there to do some of that daytime driving for you?" She was ready to offer, but she worked full-time through the day. She added, "I'm always impressed by how church people will just help each other that way. We'll just drive each other places if that's needed. I'm always impressed how church people will just help each other out that way." Did you know that in the 1st and 2nd century after Jesus' death, that one of the main ways that infant, brand new baby church grew was by looking after each other and their neighbors in times of illness. By looking after also by looking after neighbors who were not Christian. "See how they love one another," said one historian of that time. People were noticing that Christians were not running away from others with illness, but were instead helping and praying and healing and doing whatever needed to be done around the sickbed. See how they love one another, said a historian of the day who was not a Christian. Christian community has always shone in times of need, has always shone through and in interdependency. I'll help you in your time of need. When you accept my help, you are letting me serve God. And Christian community is, in fact, based on dependency. First, there are those little children we just talked about. Jesus wants us to be like little, dependent, needy children. And then there's our Savior himself, who offered himself up on the cross, as Paul put it, who became completely dependent as soon as he was in the hands of the Romans on what they decided to do for him, to him. And finally, or further, Jesus calls us to die to ourselves over and over, like that grain of wheat, which has to stop being a seed in order to fully become what is meant to be. It has to stop depending on what it knows to do, being a seed, and give up to the soil, to the warmth of the sun, to the wetness of the rain, to become something new. I've come to think that our current society's fixation on the question of physician-assisted suicide has a lot to do with our inability to imagine a life of interdependency, let alone a life of dependency. We place so much emphasis on good health. Have any of you ever heard of the comment or said it? Well, as long as you have your health, you're okay. As long as you have your health, you've got everything. False. I can show you some pretty physically healthy people who are very, very unhappy. Unhappy because they don't have love in their lives, or unhappy for all kinds of reasons. Truly, the idea that as long as we have our health, we have everything is, if I may say so bluntly, hogwash. I'm standing up here with glasses. Anybody else wear glasses or contacts? Yep. Are your eyes perfect? Nope. Are you still happy? Yep. In fact, maybe you're happy because you know those glasses are giving you help to do something you couldn't do otherwise. Maybe some of you have a creaky back or a knee that gives out on occasion. Hearing that's not what it used to be. Does that mean that we're ready for the trash heap? No. Perfect health isn't everything. It's not the goal, although we need to do our bits to stay healthy. Interdependency. It's time for another story. This is a story about Frau Steiner, Mrs. Steiner in English, also from Parkwood. As you can tell by her name, Frau Steiner is of German heritage. She immigrated to Canada in the 1950s. She lived in Germany through the terrors of the Second World War, through the bombings there, the starvation, and the terrible times after the war of trying to survive in a bombed-out country with very little food. Much of the time, Frau Steiner is quite confused due to her illness. She couldn't tell you what year it is, what century it is really, what day it is, where she is, whether she's in Germany or in Canada. She doesn't remember me from visit to visit. Sometimes she's afraid. Sometimes she's scared. But most of the time, you'll find Frau Steiner walking, singing, dancing through the halls of Parkwood and caring for her baby. And she loves to care for her baby, to rock and to hold and to feed that baby doll, which she keeps with her almost all the time. A doll that she regards as her very own living baby. Now, Frau Steiner never had children of her own, but you wouldn't know that from the love that she gives to that doll. She is a wonderful mother to her baby doll. One day, we were sitting and enjoying a cup of tea together, just the two of us, and I complimented her on her mothering skills. And she smiled. And then she said, very clearly, with great emphasis and with sadness. I cannot understand why people today still believe that warfare is a good way to conduct ourselves. When I think of how terrible the war was in Germany and how hard it was on every mother who had a son on the front lines or who watched their little ones not get enough to eat, we must stop thinking that war is any kind of an answer. I stood there, holding my cup of tea, stunned. Frau Steiner had just uttered words of such clarity and such truth. She had just fed my spirit and my soul and my peacemaking in convictions in such a way that I could have never, ever imagined when I arrived at work earlier that day or when I sat down at tea with her. Never before or never since has she spoken to me in those kind of full sentences or with that kind of conviction. Yes, Frau Steiner is dependent on us for so much. But in that conversation, I was the one who was learning. I was the dependent one. I was the one who gained from her insights. And even if Frau Steiner was never able to have a conversation like that again, even if she hadn't been able to have a conversation like that again, she is still a person of worth and a person who is loved. When we are prepared, open to being interdependent, we can learn so much from each other. I believe that this current conversation in Canada on physician-assisted suicide is a time when we as Christians can shine. We can step forward. We can volunteer at a local hospice. We can, better yet, work through our churches to care for those who are dying in their homes. We can help the caregiver. We could do some of the hard personal work of caring for someone who is near death, but needing very specific help to stay clean and dry. We can reclaim the Christian truths of loving each other and loving the least of these. We can show God's love for each other by supporting not only the people within our immediate church circle during their times of need, but supporting the atheist neighbor during his time of need, or the Hindu who doesn't have a community to help him. Now, we are not new in thinking about this. Think about Mother Teresa. Her work, the order of nuns that she founded in India, their work is founded on care for the dying. The care for those for the dying who were so destitute that they did not even have a home to die in, but were destined to die in the streets with no care, with no love. It was that hard, unbelievably hard work, that daily slogging, day in, day out, of small acts of love and mercy that earned her the appreciation of people around the world. I absolutely know that this is hard. That what I'm suggesting, is much harder than a philosophical conversation about physician-assisted suicide. It's hard to imagine recreating a Mother Teresa-esque way of helping the dying in Waterloo Region or here in Cambridge. It's hard, maybe this is the hardest of all, to think about adding something new to our already busy lives. It's hard to think, how can we as a small group change the way all of Canada looks at death? To think about now, instead, death being a friend. How can we change the way society fears dependency, is cautious about interdependency, the way we value self-sufficiency above all? I honestly don't know how to start this movement either. But I have some very basic things for us to consider, and maybe for us to talk about in the Sunday school class afterwards. So first off, as Christians, let's reclaim dying from the hospitals. Did you know that something like 80% of people want to die at home? That's our first choice, is to die at home surrounded by people we love in a setting we know. But only about 25% of us do. Why is that? It's not like we're just being scooped up to be taken to a hospital against our will. No. It's not because we're too sick to be cared for at home. No, we have excellent palliative care here in our region. It's because we don't talk about dying. It's because we don't talk about what we want at the end of our lives. We are afraid. Somehow we think that if we talk about death, we might die. Well, yes, we will die. Doesn't matter whether or not we talk about it. And so we don't plan ahead. We are afraid to discuss advance directives. We don't tell our children or our husband or whoever is our power of attorney what it is we want at the end of our days. And so we have a massive stroke. We end up in emerge with a doctor at our bedside. We are unable to think or speak, and our POA, a child, a husband, is asked, well, if we don't put her on a ventilator, she's going to die. What did your mother want? What did your wife want? I don't know, I didn't ask her. Ask her. Tell her. Tell your power of attorney. Tell your children what you want at the end of life. As Christians, let us talk about how we want to die. Let us do the hard work of preparing to die at home, because it will be work. Now you will say, but I don't want to be dependent. I don't want my children to have to do this, or my mother or my father to have to look after me, or my husband. Turn the question around. If it was your wife who was sick, would you want to look after them? Absolutely. Talk to your doctor, to your family, whoever your power of attorney is, about how you want to die, and then prepare for that. So, one of the things we can do is to reclaim dying from the hospital. Another thing we can try to do, we can think about doing, is to reclaim death from the funeral home. Now, our local funeral homes are wonderful. I have had very many fine and professional encounters with the homes in KW. I don't know Cambridge. But for those of us, at least, who are Christians, let's keep the funeral service in our church buildings, not in the funeral chapel for the convenience of it. Let's keep it here in our home, our church home, in God's home. And some of you will not agree with me on this. Let's keep the body at the funeral service so that we are reminded again and again by looking at this dead body that our lives too are going to end. That this life, it comes to an end. And that this life is not all there is. Let us keep the focus in our funerals on God and on God's resurrecting power over death, and not only on celebrating the life of the one who died. And here's another one where you might think, she has gone off her rocker. Let's consider preparing the body for burial ourselves, as we can. At the least, washing it and dressing it, as our forebears of just 100 years ago did. It's only within the last few generations that we've given all of that over to professionals. Whatever we do with funerals, let us remind ourselves that death is not the end, and that through Jesus Christ, we can claim resurrection power. And here's the one that might be hardest of all. Let us talk to each other about our fears and about our sorrows, about the burdens that we carry. Let's not make Sunday morning another time where we wear the mask of self-sufficiency, where we put on our armor of independence or our shield of, I'm just fine, thanks. Let's bear each other's burdens and share each other's joy. Let interdependency and dependency be our mottos, not, I did it my way. Let us see if we can again bring truth to the words that described that first century church, those first century Christians, as they cared for the sick and the dying among them. See how they love each other. See how they love each other. Amen. So be it.